Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Good morning. It is so wonderful to be in a room full of people who are not only willing to talk about sexual violence, but who are leading the talk about sexual violence. And I think in the morning it's good for us to recognize that our voices are more powerful when they are united. And so I'm going to ask for you to join in with me. And this just says, "Silence no more, I was born to roar." So the first time I sing it, it's going to go up. The second time it's going to go down. If that means nothing to you, let the notes fall out of your mouth. Any way that pleases you. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Did you hear that? If not, let the notes fall out. Let's go. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Again. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Let's try it with sign. Get your hands ready. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Silence no more, I was born to roar. One last time. Silence no more, I was born to roar. Silence no more, I was born to roar. And we give ourselves a hand inside. And so we are here, daughters and sons of the civil rights movement. We are here, those who lived during the season of the civil rights movement. We are here, survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse and sexual harassment and even sex trafficking. We are here. And the beautiful thing about our stories is we recognize that violence and oppression, discrimination and assault did not get the final say in our story. I like to tell survivors that I'm working with, the trauma affects us, but it doesn't define us. That we are more than what has been done to us. And so all of us have books that we are walking around with that represent our lives. And there are some times in your life when people wrote on the pages of your book and you could not stop them, but you can decide that what they wrote is not my final chapter. And so I give myself permission to turn the page and say, what next? And I am so excited that those of you who are in the room are those who were survivors, who cared about survivors, who loved survivors, who made a commitment that the violence and violation that either you experienced firsthand or through vicarious trauma, through societal trauma, that you made a decision that that would not be the final imprint on the page. And that is why we are here. We are here because you have made it a commitment and a priority to go after the resources to make manifest the kind of society we want to live in. And that is something we can all celebrate. When I used to work in a suite of offices and my focus area with clients is trauma and sexual trauma recovery, I had a therapist who was in the office next to me, and she said, "I just find it hard to believe that your area of focus is trauma because there's always so much laughter coming out of your room." And that's why it's important that at a sexual trauma, a sexual violence conference, that we give ourselves breath, that we give ourselves music, that we give ourselves community, that we even give ourselves laughter. Because there's a Chinese proverb that says, an empty glass can give no one water. And so if we are just running on fumes of rage, if we are only running on fumes of disappointment, there is not very much that will be accomplished. And so this is our secret meeting to come in and fuel up. This is the secret meeting for us to become refilled so we can go back to our various places recharged and ignited and excited about the work at hand, because it takes a lot of strategy and it takes a lot of spirit to do what we are called to do, what we have been positioned to do. And I do believe that this work is a calling because most people don't want to touch it. And so I just think you're not in it for the money. I think that you're just not in it for the fame and fortune. I believe there is something on the inside of you that called you to this work, and I'm so glad that you said yes. And so we have to be strategic about doing things that allow me to keep my yes, so that I don't get to the place where I have to lay it down and cannot do it anymore. So I want to thank so much your organizers and leadership team for inviting me here today, and the wonderful dialogues that we were able to have about the work that you all are doing and that you are planning to do. So our theme for this morning is, and let me just do this, I'm going to reveal myself. I believe in transparency. So I am the daughter of two ministers, and in the Black church tradition, we have a lot of call and response. So y'all aren't going to sit here for an hour just blinking at me. Okay, that just will make me uncomfortable. So you can just turn to the person next to you and say, good morning. That feels better. That feels better. So our theme for the hour we have on today is Now What? Lessons from the Civil Rights Movement for the Me Too movement. And we recognize in order for us to bring about transformation and change, it requires a movement. If we are only working as individuals, we will get exhausted and burned out and outmaneuvered. How many of you know when you work in settings and environments and workplaces, there's always a meeting before the meeting? Have you figured that out yet? If you go to the meeting and that's your first time talking about it, trick's on you, okay? They have already met. I discovered that later, okay? So you need to start having a meeting before the meeting so you can come in with a strategy and with clarity. And so this here is the meeting before the meeting. So we can go back with strategy that can be implemented nationwide, and then perpetrators will look up and say, what happened? They got organized. And we get to that place of knowing we have to shift out of just the why. A lot of times personally and in research, we keep asking the question why. And there are a lot of studies that help us to look at what are the risk factors and what are the protective factors, and we have done that for decades, right? But we have to get to a place where I don't just want to know the why, we need the now what. And that's a part of what I help survivors to understand as well, because do you understand you can lose decades of your life trying to figure out why? Why did they target me? Why did they do what they did? I just need them to answer the question. And what I tell people in that setting is you have to get to the place where you take your recovery out of their hands. If you are waiting for an offender to explain to you why, there is nothing that they can say to you that will make it, oh, okay, I get it now. There's no answer. And so instead, we really have to get to the place of we have all our list of risk factors. We know all of these protective factors. Now, what are we doing with that information to mobilize and to mobilize collectively so we're not just saving a few, right? And it's important to attend to the few, but we want to have our mind on the many, and to think about it collectively, we have to understand movement. And so one of the movements that we can gain insight from is the civil rights movement, because they were outpowered, outnumbered, but they stood on the side of justice. And that is the only way that you can keep doing this work, because while it may not be a lot of people who are vocally pro-sexual violence, by their behavior, they let you know it's not a priority. And so when you are working in some context, amen. Any feminist, you can say, I woman. Any Afrocentric, you can say, Ashe. And if you're just community-oriented, you can say, that's what's up. Okay. So, there are many of us that have recognized that, unfortunately, there are hot topics that people are willing to put energy and resources behind, and sexual violence is often not on that list. And it is often not on that list because it makes people uncomfortable, because they have never been taught to talk about it, sometimes because they are survivors who have not dealt with their stuff, and sometimes because they are offenders themselves in high places. And so we have to get very strategic about our movement, and I'm glad to see that happening. So the history of the movement, the civil rights movement, is in the 1950s and 1960s. African Americans organized and started working strategically for equal access to resources, to opportunities, when we look at employment, when we look at education, when we look at housing, and also discrimination and hate crimes. So they did not just start then, they had to re-spark because there was an original movement that was for emancipation. And then there's a book that's called Free to Do What? Because you can be emancipated and still blocked, right? And so then they had to get organized to figure out how do we move forward in order to really have the access that we have been promised and that we are due. Likewise, when we look at the Me Too movement, it was founded by an African-American female activist who I understand will be here tomorrow or the next day for those who are staying. Sister Burke founded it in 2005, but it really became popular last year in 2017. It is to bring attention to the realities and the pervasiveness of sexual harassment and sexual assault, initially really attending to it in the lives of women. As we look at the movement and how it has played out, while it was started by an African-American female in 2005, the persons who have been the most highlighted have been those who have more power and privilege when we think of race and when we think about socioeconomic status. And so we always have to be mindful in a movement of who is being left out, who is being centered, and who is being marginalized. And it's a powerful thing when your movement can get hijacked. That even when you start something, that there are those who will come and take it over and keep the name but change it into something that fits their purposes. And it's fine to expand, but the problem is when people expand and subtract, right? That they add themselves and subtract you. And so we have to be very intentional about the movement that we are involved in when we say that I want to fight for against sexual violence. Then who really are we fighting for? And sometimes we have this blanketed response of I'm fighting for everyone, but when I say I'm fighting for everyone in a colorblind and culture-blind approach, then I am really subtracting those who are usually marginalized, right? The usual suspects are subtracted from the movement. And so we have to be intentional about who we give voice to, not only around race, around gender, around socioeconomic status, about sexual orientation and gender identity, around migration status as well. So I want to say how I approach this work, how I come to this experience. The first is that I am a survivor of sexual assault. And for me, it's very important for me to name that reality. When I was sexually assaulted, I was a college student at Duke University, and I went home to Baltimore, where I'm from, for the holidays. And a young man who was a member of my church came to my house, and because I knew him, I let him in. He rang the doorbell, and I let him in. Somebody say she let him in. Because oftentimes we are prepared to look out for strangers. Oftentimes we are told, especially your daughter's going away to college, make sure, you don't go anywhere with anybody you don't know. Be really mindful because there are people who are out to attack, out to get you, and they never say it'll be someone sitting in the pew next to you, right? They never say it's someone who would have known you your whole life and afterwards would have said, I wanted to do that since you were little. So I had that experience, and I had no words and no voice, and when I returned back to Duke University, for the first time in my life, I suffered academically. There are different domains of self-esteem. And the domain I always was excellent with was academics. I was always a straight A student. It came easily for me, and it was a big part of my identity. So I did not know what to do when I started taking exams and getting D's. I could not, and I didn't even make the connection between my failing grades and the sexual assault. I could not understand it. And so when I finally, as a result of some nightmares and flashbacks, started making the connection of maybe this is why I can't study, I can't figure these things out, representation matters. I looked around the campus for someone who I could talk to, and there was one black dean who happened to have the same last name as me, although we weren't related. So I went to the dean's office. I did not go to the counseling center. I did not go to student health. I went to the person who looked like me. And I went and found this dean, and I told her what happened when I was home in Baltimore. And she got very nervous and flustered. And she said, "I'll be right back." And she left me in the office, and she was gone for a while, you all. Somebody say a while. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Like, did I say something wrong? Should I have come here? And when she came back in the room, can I tell you what she had? A plate of food. Cultural. She did not have the words. She knew she needed to give me something. And the only thing she could think to give me was a plate of food. And so although I had no appetite, I recognized she was trying to give me something. So I sat there and I ate the food. And that began my healing journey, a plate of food. And thankfully, even though it was not her area, she had enough wisdom to direct me to the counseling center. And so my first therapist was actually an older white male who is not someone I would have ever chosen to talk to. But it helped me to heal. And this is so important for those of you who do not look like all of the communities that we want to represent, which is all of us. None of us represent everybody. Is sometimes people are nervous to talk about culture because they think if I talk about it, if we name it, it's going to highlight my inadequacy. But it's important to recognize that people read heart and spirit, they read intent. And so while there can be additional barriers of distrust, people are savvy enough to pay attention to figure out, is this person for me, right? Can this person stand with me? And so while we were the opposite in every category, we figured it out. We figured it out. So we want to consider the realities of sexual violence, sexual trauma, and what the recovery process looks like, and know that there are many survivors who fly under the radar. If our students are coping, or if survivors are coping by using substances, by various acting out behaviors, often they come to our attention. But my survival story is different because I coped with a spirit of excellence. And I know there are some survivors in here. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. Just blink at me. Some of us cope by being busy. You're very, very busy. And people want to know how you got that resume. You're very, very, very busy. And so often people can miss us and think that you don't need services, support, or help because you have mastered how to put all of that energy into trying to make your life into something. And there is a difference between busyness and healed. Did you know that? So it's very different to do things because I want to do them versus doing them because I can't be still. And so in our work and in our services, we have to learn how to attend to those who show up in different ways, not just those who fall apart. My cultural tradition, my grandmother would say, no matter what, something better shine. What does that mean? It means no matter how you're feeling, put some lipstick on, put some lotion on, and put on your church smile. How are you doing? Blessed. I'm blessed. I'm fabulously blessed, right? And so we have to be able to see beyond that. It's not that that is not a part of who they are, but I have to also be able to see underneath that so that we can provide services for everybody instead of assuming that some people are superhuman or goddesses or don't need help. Not only that, I am a daughter of the civil rights movement. And so my father was born in 1943. He was very active as a college student in Baltimore, Maryland, at the historically black college, Morgan State University, leading a lot of the sit-ins and the marches. He was at the I Have a Dream speech. He is a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and a large part of the leadership for the civil rights movement came out of these various church traditions. And so seeing and hearing his reality, he kept that spirit of activism and social justice going even when I grew up. And so I can remember as a church community, we weren't just there on Sundays, but during the week we would go to protests and marches and rallies, and he would have voter registration. And so that was a part of my collective experience. To the point it was so interesting when I became an APA representative, American Psychological Association representative to the United Nations. One of the first conferences that I attended was the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa. And when I went there, I was in my mid-20s. And it was very interesting because a group of Black South Africans came to me and said to me, "We really admire you all's movement. How did you do it?" I said, I was in my 20s. How did you do it? So it took me a minute to click and register, what they're asking me. And so then they said, "We have the laws changed on the books, but how do you change hearts and minds?" Right? And so isn't that a part of what we're trying to do around prevention, is we have some policies and some laws that are written, but how do we shift hearts and minds, right? Which is a much harder reality, although the policies need to be there. So the context is similar when we think about, in some ways similar, in some ways different, the civil rights movement and the Me Too movement. One is that the realities that we're facing are overwhelming, right? When we look at the experiences of racial terrorism, right, in the form of racism, both historically and in contemporary times, that becomes overwhelming. And some people have become so overwhelmed that they either are shut down or just in a place of rage. And we have to understand where that is coming from and be able to respond with compassion. Likewise, with sexual violence, the issues are so pervasive. When we look at the numbers, when we encounter people, as a college student, I worked at the Rape Crisis Center. During that time, we would carry a pager. And when it first hit me that every time when my pager went off, someone was being raped, it really shifts your mindset. You have to do some mental gymnastics in order to carry that reality, right? And so getting to a place of understanding it is overwhelming, it is huge, it is problematic, it is disastrous, but we are many. But we have the capacity to turn things around. So when I talk to people who are in the field of mental health or in our various service industries, I say, for me to do this work, I have to believe in miracles. That's the only way you can do it and not be bitter, right? Is that I have to look at the reality of things and also recognize what is possible, that there is more possible than what I currently see. So I like to call it a realist with wings. Because if you're an optimist, then people think you have your head in the clouds and you don't recognize the reality of things and you're not really tuned in. I mean, do you see what is happening? How can you have peace or how can you have joy? I refuse to be devoured by racism, by sexual violence, by oppression. I refuse to be devoured. And so in order to not be devoured, I have to have something that feeds me, some things that feed me. I used to work at a sexual violence program on the East Coast, and one day I was walking into work and the assistant director stopped me and she said, "Thema, you always look so happy." And I get the feeling it has nothing to do with this place. I said, "You're right." You are very perceptive. If I was dependent on here for my joy, I would be as miserable as everybody who works here. Right? I have to get my mind right before I show up so I have something to give and something to pour. And so for those of us who are doing the work, and sometimes you're doing the work in a toxic place, and if you're here with your coworkers, don't look at them, just look at me. Don't look. You have to figure out a way to feed you so that you show up not overwhelmed, because the situation can be overwhelming, yes? Not only that, we attend to the realities of intersectionality. In the civil rights movement, we are clear that not all voices were treated equally, right? So there was definitely male privilege in the movement. And even when you interview women who are part of the movement, they'll talk about having to be strategic and not having to take the credit. So giving their ideas away as they're cooking the meals, and then the idea gets up in front, and you're not going to get a shout out, and just be at peace with that, right? When you're not invested always in your name being called, sometimes you can still make impact. Not only that, around gender, but we know around sexual orientation, that members of the movement who were gay or lesbian were largely closeted or were not allowed to be central figures. And so the movement was not perfect, while it did accomplish a lot. And we can say the same thing about the Me Too movement, that certain voices are being highlighted, predominantly white, wealthy, straight women celebrities. And we attend to the realities of multiple forms of oppression that are happening that silence certain voices. So I want to be mindful of some people wanting peace but no justice. Peace is they want us to stop talking about it. You still talking about rape? You need like a new line of research. You need like a new topic. Still? It just seems like you should look into something more hopeful. Something positive. Why don't you talk about something positive? So some people want your silence even though they don't want justice. Along those lines, I'll give you this quick story. I told you all I did the conference in South Africa. And when I was in South Africa, I learned about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Anybody familiar with that? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in the aftermath of apartheid. They set this up, and they wanted people who had been a part of oppressing Black South Africans to be able to come and confess what they did, and for them to be forgiven, and for the country to move forward. Okay, so it was to tell your story, and then we're going to unite and we're going to move forward. So some of the critiques of that program would talk about it in this way, with this story. They said, it's like in South Africa, if there's a little boy with a bike, and the boy had his bike for a couple of days, and then a neighbor boy steals his bike. And for days, the boy who had his bike stolen is looking out the window and seeing the neighbor boy ride his bike up and down the street. And then after a number of weeks pass, the neighbor boy who stole the bike comes to the victim's door and knocks on the door. And the boy opens the door and says, "You're the boy who stole my bike." And the thief says, "Yes, I stole your bike. Please forgive me." And the victim says, "Where's my bike?" And the little boy says, "Let's not talk about the bike. It's not about the bike. It's about friendship. It's about reconciliation. It's about you and me getting along as brothers. Will you forgive me? You need to forgive me." And so we get to a place of recognizing, before we can talk about forgiveness and reconciliation, where's the bike? Where's the bike? Where is justice for sexual assault survivors? Where is justice for those who are survivors of multiple forms of oppression? And often we want to skip to the kumbaya and let's just all be united. And the most popular thing when we want to have cross-cultural dialogue is a potluck. Let's go, right? Come on, you better get your cornbread. Get your cornbread. I'm going to bring my food. We're going to eat. It's just going to be great. Thema, it's going to be so great. Okay, a potluck is a wonderful start. But until we start dealing with the bike, the injustices that are in the organization, then we really cannot heal and move forward. And we recognize that the need for transformation and justice is important. And I kept using that word before, strategic. In the civil rights movement and in the Me Too movement, we had to figure out and have to continue to figure out the distinction between strategy and silence. In the civil rights movement, they kept telling Dr. King to wait. Now is not the time, right? If you integrate the schools now, it's going to be so disruptive. People don't feel safe. They're going to be angry. So just wait, and we're gonna do it when the time is right. And sometimes that happens also around sexual violence. Oh, no, we don't want to put that on this program, right? This program is going to be upbeat. This program is going to be positive, right? No, this grant money is not for that, right? We're going to get to that when the time is right. And so, yes, we have to be strategic, but we have to also become aware of when we are being silenced, and then also figuring out a way to shatter the silence in ways that people can hear it, right? Not every sexual violence prevention lecture, presentation can be heard by every audience. So then it is about me being strategic about how do I present the information, the material, in a way that people can digest and hear. Yes? So what are the lessons that we learned? Lesson 1 is we recognize the need for an interdisciplinary mandate, respecting diverse approaches. So for the civil rights movement, we had people doing all kinds of work, right? We had the Panthers who were creating a breakfast program and creating schools and creating provision for self-defense. And then we had those who were marching. We had those who were doing sit-ins. We had those in the NAACP who were working to address the law. And so one of the things that the Center of Disease Control has learned is we have to have a multi-pronged approach, that all of the different forms of intervention are needed and necessary. And just like there is not a hierarchy on trauma, we have to get out of our mindset there is not a hierarchy on intervention. Meaning, it is problematic to think that what we do is the key and other people's work is more marginal, right? Because the issue is so systematic and pervasive that it requires all of us in our diverse camps doing what we do. And so some will have the Take Back the Night March. Some people are using social media. And what I have discovered is people who aren't into social media are quick to dismiss it, right? I don't have time for that. Not understanding what is the impact when we have a sexual violence prevention message trending on Twitter. If you don't understand what that means, get some millennials on your team. It means you are shifting a national and sometimes global conversation, right? Reaching people where they are, getting resources beyond these kind of normal traditional routes. Not only that, when we think about consciousness raising, and a lot of work now being done around empowerment, particularly empowerment of girls and women, not just stopping at the place of self-defense, but recognizing the need to resist internalized forms of gender oppression, right? I'll give you this example of a survivor who wrote a poem, and she talks about being sexually assaulted by the guy she was dating, and she was abstaining, and he had agreed to that. And one day they were in his apartment, they were in his room, and he kept going. She told him to stop. He starts assaulting her. His friends are in the living room, and she says, I didn't make a fuss because I didn't want to embarrass him in front of his friends. Right? This is internalized gender roles about who it is you're supposed to protect, even over yourself, right? That we often have been told to be ladylike. What does that mean, right? To not raise a fuss. And then when you don't raise a fuss, then people say, why didn't you fight? Right? So you become really in a bind of silence and role and assumption that can leave a lot of people in a place of shame and self-blame. We have to also recognize those who are doing the work around debunking myths and doing programs with diverse audiences. Not only that, our workshops, our resistance training, and I really get uncomfortable when I hear people who do one form of intervention putting down other groups, right? Is that just me, or have you heard that? Right? If you're sitting next to them, just give a slight nod. You're like, those are like, this is what works. My thing is the thing that works, and people are just wasting their money, wasting their time with these other things. I'm glad you feel real good about your program, but there are multiple things that can work, right? And so we have to get to a place of being interdisciplinary and respecting other people's discipline and contribution, that all of us have a role to play. And when we're all working together, what is it? The teamwork makes the dream work, right? Instead of this idea of my team is more important than your team. My team is more valuable than your team. And so respecting all of our diverse approaches, and then we can actually learn something from each other, right? We cannot accomplish very much when we're no longer teachable. And it's a painful thing to interact with people who think they know it all. It's a painful thing. And so getting a lesson from the civil rights movement would be taking a collectivistic approach and adopting some humility, right? So yes, you know what you know, and that's wonderful, and share it, but then to be able to build bridges with others. Lesson 2 is attending to the margins within the movement. So we have these different interventions and prevention strategies that we have found helpful and work. We recognize that we need to do things over time, that we need multiple interventions, that we need bystander programs, that we have to address men and boys. We recognize like all of these different pieces, but even within that, are we truly attending to culture and diversity and the realities of oppression? As one Native American psychologist says, American Indian psychologist says, there is more than making a program available to our communities than taking your program and putting some feathers on it, right? There is so much more. And so taking the time to recognize for racial and ethnic minority survivors, what are some of the additional barriers? So there are some universals, right? We would say those intrapsychic factors that affect all of us, right? So intrapsychic factors can be fear and shame and confusion, right? But then there are some culturally specific barriers that we have to attend to with our different groups. So for example, with racial and ethnic minorities, recognizing the distrust of systems, health professionals, police officers, judges, and courtrooms, and recognizing that that distrust is not a figment of their imagination. When I was taking the licensure exam for psychology, one of the questions was about healthy paranoia. So healthy paranoia is a term for when you believe people are after you and they're after you. Yeah. It's good to be a little vigilant sometimes, right? And so when your community and you as an individual has experience, and they have done criminal justice studies that documented that you're less likely to get justice when you are a racial or ethnic minority woman survivor, and low income as well, and the people who assault you are more likely to get less time, right? We look at media coverage. You would think no black children get kidnapped. Wouldn't you think that? Nobody wants Shaquita. Shaquita doesn't make it on the news, right? And so the media has decided who are the children that we believe our viewers will care about. So when it becomes a reality of distrusting these different agencies, then it doesn't work for us just to say you need to just report or you just need to tell. We have to do the work of addressing those systems, right, in order to make it a more just environment and context so they're not set up for failure. They are also aware of the stereotypes that exist about their different groups, right? So Latinas understand what are the stereotypes that people believe about Latina women and their sexuality, the stereotypes that people assume about Asian women or about Black women. One of the things we know from research is that pornography with ethnic minority women is more likely to eroticize violence. So if people are training their ejaculation to your humiliation and pain, what does that mean, right? What are the consequences of that? And so if we are not tuned into those realities, then we can miss it. And we know that it cannot just be a colorblind approach. The same thing when we look at, I do want to say racial and ethnic minorities, that sometimes there has been a pressure to protect the offender because they are a member of the community. And so many members of our community have already been incarcerated in the prison industrial complex. And so what I say when I'm talking to our community members is, if you report, and that's your choice, but if you report, you are not the one who's betraying the community. The person who's going around abusing and molesting members of the community is the one who's betraying the community, right? So it requires a shifting of our understanding, and what we have been taught is our responsibility for silence. The idea, even for the LGBTQ community, this idea that people already think negatively about us. And so not wanting to give anybody any more fuel, any more information that they can use to try to justify their homophobia and heterosexism. Yes? When we think of inclusive, diverse gender identities, again, we have the issue of blame, right? Where people will say, well, because of the way you are presenting yourself, that is the cause of your sexual violence. So if we do not address that, as well as the internalized transphobia, internalized heterosexism, internalized racism, then we are missing it. We're missing it. And how do you address it? You have to be able to name it. Now, when you first name it, are people gonna give you a cookie and a star? No, right? When I went to do my my training, my internship, I went up to Boston to Harvard Medical Center. I had 7 supervisors, and they were all white. And when I went to meet with each of them one-on-one that first week, I got to one of them. Actually, she was the last one. And she says to me, Thema, I just want you to know, if anything comes up this year related to race or racism, that I'm someone that you can talk to. Now, to me, it was awkward. It was weird. I didn't know why she was saying it. I just kind of gave her a nod, like, right? But somebody say a few months later, when the racism showed up and I needed to figure out what to do, she was the one who I went back and talked to because she had identified herself, right? So some of us allow ourselves to be silenced because it's not immediate gratification, right? If you just name that you want to be an ally or you want to be of service, no one's going to throw you a parade, but you identify yourself, and then you don't just wait for other people to speak up. When you see there are issues, sometimes as a minority person or as a sexual violence survivor, it gets tiring to always be the one that has to speak. And so being willing to give voice to the issues is very important, yes? But when people of the community are willing, able, safe to speak, instead of saying, I'm going to speak for them, pass the mic. Pass the mic, pass the mic. All right. So being invested in addressing persons who are differently able, when we look at issues of access and ability and who we are attending to, we started today singing in sign language. What do we have in place to help survivors who speak in sign language, right? What do we have in terms of access to our programs? Immigrant survivors attending to those who are documented and undocumented, and recognizing the increased risk of those who are facing both legal and linguistic barriers and boundaries, and that it is systematic. And so to not just say, well, this program is for everyone, right? If you don't address my realities and my experience, then you're going to miss it. I won't name the place, but I used to do sexual harassment training for an institution. Don't Google. And I was so upset when I first came because they had me do a sexual harassment training in a room about this big for the custodian staff. And I came in to do the training, and there were 2 or 3 tables of people who did not speak English. There were no translators provided. And at the end of my 3-hour training, everyone had to sign to say they had attended. Right? And they're going to check and say, we provided it for everyone. So we have to really be tuned into who are our programs ignoring? Who is it we have centered, and who is it we have marginalized? Looking at low and high income, both of these are important to attend to. Our survivors who do not have resources, so we need to quit, as some mental health professionals do, being quick to label people resistant to care. Have you heard that term? Resistant to care, that's what they put in your file when you're not showing up, because they never want to say, maybe my intervention doesn't work. Maybe I'm not interesting, right? No. I'm always interesting. You're resistant to care, right? And often resistant to care becomes a cover-up for people who have problems with transportation, issues with child care, and do not understand what it is that you all are supposed to be doing, right? An orientation to services and to the program to understand what is this. Some people came and they thought you were going to fix it in one meeting. So they don't understand that they're supposed to come here for months, right? So very low income, but then also high income, working with survivors who are very wealthy, who have the status, can create some additional barriers about trying to reach help, trying to access help. So while we recognize their privilege, we have to also recognize the additional layers that come with persons who are living in that context as they're trying to survive. Varying educational levels we know have an impact, and our big piece with cultural oppression and cultural awareness for survivors is we want to move beyond tokenism. Tokenism is when people want your face but not your voice. Right? They'll be quick to include a picture of you on the brochure. This is our staff. We just love Thema. Just love her, just love her. But in a meeting, not wanting you to speak, unless you're agreeing with what they're saying, right? And can you give voice to your experience and it not just be considered that you're not a team player? Well, if the team all has the same cultural background and so is in agreement, then maybe I'm not a team player because I see some gaps, right? And so being able to move beyond tokenism means to value diverse voices and experiences and contributions and creating room at the table for everyone to be appreciated and valued. I worked at one place and I was invited to sit in on the upper management's meeting. It was once a month, and so I would come to these meetings, and then one day a lady who was at the meeting invited me to lunch. And those of you who are like me, you would call it perceptive. In my tradition, I would call it discernment. But sometimes people invite you to lunch and you know there's like more to the story. Have you ever had one of those? Let's have lunch, right? And you can just feel like it's, something is coming. So I said, okay. So we go to lunch and, we're eating, very small talk, but you can feel, have you ever you can feel it coming, right? Okay, we got through soup or salad, nothing. Okay, entree, still not saying nothing, right? We on eggshells, but I can feel she's working her courage up to say what she came here to say, but okay. So now, we're on dessert and tea, it's almost over, and then she says, Thema, she puts her little plate away. I wanted to invite you to lunch because when you were invited to the upper management meeting, it really wasn't for you to talk. It was just for you to hear what we're discussing. Well, now, if you don't want my voice at the meeting, maybe I shouldn't be at the meeting. But interestingly, I really appreciate you meeting with me, but you're not the one who invited me to the meeting. So when I hear from the person who invited me that they don't want me to speak, then I'll consider that, but thank you so much for lunch. In our tradition, we would call that nice nasty, right? It's like, I want to invite you to lunch, right? So moving beyond tokenism, lesson 3, collaborating with multiple communities, networking with allies. And so we have to get out of our little boxes, right? And the thing that becomes painful about that is it means sharing power, right? As long as I only work with my team and I'm clear about my team, then we can own it. We can own the grant, right? We can own the program. We can own the resources. But the more that I start to network and build bridges, then I am having to open up the resources, the vision, the time and space, and having to have some flexibility, right? Can I tell you what not to do? And I know you all are recording, but hopefully what I'm talking about, no one will be able to say, oh, that was me. I have had the experience where people apply for grants and then they're told they need to have some diverse voices. So then they contact me to add me as a diversity consultant so they get the grant, and then I never hear back from them. Okay? That is not collaboration. That is jumping through hoops to get your money. So we have to be very intentional about valuing the different pieces that people bring. When I talk about community gatekeepers and community organizers, we have to again have the humility, because we can have in our mind what we want to do, and then when you connect with that community, they have a different vision about either what they need or what they believe will work. And so being able to be flexible and expansive so that we can really have a team. Having the training to connect with media is so important. And there's a lot of conversation now in the news about media. And when I talk about strategy, we have to be able to own the narrative. We can't just be reactive, right? So with the civil rights movement, they owned all of these different avenues to be able to say, we are the minority, we're being mistreated. But when people see the story, right, that all we're doing is singing and walking across this bridge, when they see the story and then see how we are treated, then something can shift and happen. But then they have to be able to interview someone who can articulate what they're seeing, because sometimes people cannot translate the visual, right? What do I mean by that? In Los Angeles, a local news station did a story with a sex trafficking survivor. So that was very important to raise awareness. She was in her late teens. The trafficker had since been arrested, and unfortunately, she had just gotten away. I would say it was like a couple of weeks before they had her on this news program. So the local news did the story, and they contacted me. Someone referred them to me. The next day, they contacted me, and they said, you know, we need to know if you can come on because this didn't turn out the way we wanted. If you look on our website where people can comment, after the news story, they posted the video, and people were writing all of these terrible things to the young woman. And of course, that was not the intention of the newscaster, and they couldn't figure out what happened. So I'm reading these like terrible, terrible comments. I said, let me watch the video. I watch the video, and what I see is what we traditionally see in mental health. To get through her story, the survivor is smiling, right? So it throws the whole, people don't know what they're looking at. So the comments are, you liked it, that was your boyfriend, you're not trafficked, you're lying, look at you, you're this, you're that, right? So I had to go on the next day to explain why sometimes our emotions, our physical emotion, does not match our experience. And the importance to tune into the content of what people are saying instead of just looking at the facial expression, right? Because some people have a nervous laugh or a nervous smile. Some people look blank, right? They're telling a terrible story and there's nothing there, which is why I tell our students who are in training, you have to be careful, because as human beings, we are trained, we are tuned into mirroring each other. So if you're not careful, when someone's laughing, you start laughing with them, right? Which is why at fancy restaurants, they train waiters to nod their head when they offer you something. More wine? And you're like, you want some dessert? Right? So as a person who works with sexual violence survivors, if I'm not careful, I'll find myself laughing when nothing is funny and smiling when nothing is happy. So I have to disconnect from the face I'm seeing and hear what people are saying, so I make my face match the words, right? So we need people with an understanding to be able to communicate to the larger world. How is it that someone could be sexually assaulted and that night go to a fashion show? Right? People who don't understand that will blame them, and the narrative will seem to be inconsistent. It's not inconsistent to try to forget about what just happened and go out with your friends, right? But until you have those of us who are positioned to help them frame the story, then we're going to miss that. Lesson 4, we're moving forward. Understanding that in the civil rights movement, a large piece that helped them, I'm just checking my time, a large piece that helped them to continue to move forward is, for the large part, the movement was based in a faith tradition. So it's not that everyone has to have the same religion, but I would say whatever you believe in, it has to be something that takes you higher, right? It has to be something that feeds you so that you can do the work and not be in a place of burnout, right? So what I often chant to address all of our diverse traditions is Christians would say, Spirit is calling me to a higher place of praise. And Buddhists would say, Buddha is calling me to a higher place of praise. And Muslims would say, Allah is calling me to a higher place of praise. And Jewish persons would say, Adonai is calling me to a higher place of praise. And feminists would say, Goddess is calling me to a higher place of praise. And even atheists and agnostics would say, my highest self is calling me to a higher place of praise. So if you're going to do the work, you have to have something that is calling you higher, right? Something that is allowing you to have hope, to have spirit, to not be in that place of burnout. And I used to do workshops on self-care. And what I discovered, well, one thing I want to say is often self-care gets described as only individual focused. But in the civil rights movement, it was also about collective care, right? How do we care for each other as sisters and brothers? So if you are running a program, how are you caring for your staff? You know, are you just trying to get the numbers? Now, I understand we're trying to get the numbers, but if we are so busy trying to get the numbers, we lose sight of our people, then we're in trouble, right? And so some organization got upset because they wanted me to talk about self-care, and I talked about how the organization also had a responsibility. They didn't like that part. Just tell them to exercise and eat right. Yes, and there are some systemic approaches to collective self-care around supervision and hours, right? And being able to say no. They don't want me to tell their employees that sometimes you have to set boundaries, right? So in order to feed our spirits, you have to think about what are the things that allow me to be inspired to keep doing the work so that the anger is not the thing that's fueling me. I do spoken word poetry, and I used to live up in Boston, and I had a poet, Jamal, gifted poet. He came up to me one day after a little coffee house, and he said, Thema, I don't really get it. You and I are talking about the same thing, but everybody loves you and everybody hates me. And it was the anger, right? So we can talk about the same thing, but because he was in such an angry place, as soon as a lot of people can't tolerate anger even when it's justified. So they would hear him when he would start, and they would just shut down, and they couldn't hear the message, right? So we have to be mindful that our primary voice is not just the anger, even though the anger may be righteous, right? But to be able to speak about it in a way that talks about what needs to change and how, right? And how. because people get overwhelmed when it's just things are terrible. Right? This is bad, this is so bad, this is bad. Okay, like how can we make it better? Yes. So we have to nourish ourselves and nourish our spirits. As time passes, we also notice with the civil rights movement, and when we think about now 2018, times change and people need different strategies. And so some strategies people will continue, like people still do marches or petitions. Some organizations still exist, but they also recognize that new times also require new approaches to movements. And so we also discovered with the civil rights movement that it had to be bigger than a person, right? So Dr. King was assassinated, and they thought that would kill the dream and the vision, but it didn't die because it was bigger than him, right? So we have had some experiences in the last week or so with the Me Too movement where some critical persons have been named in terms of their own inadequacies and their own mistreatment of others. And so if we have put all of our emphasis on placing certain people on a pedestal, then the whole thing crumbles. But when we recognize it is bigger than an individual, it is bigger than a group of individuals, that it's about what's just and what's right and about compassion, then as the setbacks happen and as time changes and events change, we can adjust and figure out what are the things we've been doing that work, that we keep doing, and then also having space for innovation, for newness, for possibility. So I would encourage you on today to think about the vision for what you would see our society being once all of you have done the work that you are doing. And I know for your applications, you have to write, like, what are these goals and how are we going to measure that? But I would say even larger than that, if you could take a bird's eye view of all of the programs and interventions that are represented in this room, and if all of us win, right? If all of us are successful and hopefully also are mentoring other people, right? So that we have some early career and some students who are involved in our work. If we duplicate that and multiply that, then what will it look like? So I want to close with this when we think about going higher. It's a story and then a poem. So I lived in Liberia, West Africa for high school. I'm African American, but my parents, I told you, worked through the church, and so they were assigned to do some work in Liberia, West Africa, and so that's where I spent my 10th and 11th grade years. And so I want to tell you a Liberian story, and I'm going to give it to you in diluted Liberian English. If I gave it to you in strong Liberian English, we would not understand the story, okay? So we're going to dilute it so that you can understand. And as I tell the story, in Liberia, when people tell a story, they start off by saying once upon a time, and after they say once upon a time, you have to say time, or they think you're not listening. Is that all right? All right. Once upon a time. Once upon a time. Once upon a time in Liberia, there was one man who was an animal expert. This man knew every animal in the bush. You people say forest, the real word, that bush. In the bush, if he see lion, he know the thing lion. If he see bear, he know the thing bear. If he see tiger, he know the thing tiger. He know every animal in the bush. So one day, the animal expert is walking so behind one farm. Behind the farm, he sees so chicken. In the middle of the chicken, he see one eagle. What the eagle doing with all these chicken? The animal expert walks to the front of the farm. He gets to the front door. He say bop bop. In America, you people say knock knock, the real word, that bop bop. So he say bop bop. The man inside say who that? The man outside say that me. You must open the door and see. So he opened the door. He said, what your business here? He said, my man, I'm an animal expert. I know every animal in the bush. Behind you farm, you got so chicken and you got one eagle. The farmer started laughing. He said, hey, man, I ain't got no eagle. I only got chicken. The animal expert said, let me show you. So they get to the back of the farm. He pick up the one he say is an eagle. He put it on his arm. He say, listen to me. You must tell it, say, listen to me. He said, listen to me. You're not chicken. You eagle. They can't fly. You can fly. So fly. The eagle look at the man. He look at the farmer. He look at his chicken brother and sister. And he said, this man talking foolishness. He jumped down off the man's arm and he go with his chicken brother and sister. The farmer start laughing. I told you I only got chicken. The animal expert is vexed. And he's shamed. You know, he's so shamed because he's supposed to be animal expert. So he said, I coming back tomorrow. I coming to go. So he go. The next day he come so soon in the morning, God himself was not awake yet. He go to the door and what he say? Hey, yeah. Okay, you listening. He say, Papa. The man inside say, who that? The man outside say, that me. He opened the door. He said, why you come here so soon in the morning? He said, I coming to show you something. He goes to the back of the farm. He picked up the eagle. This time he climbed on the roof of the barn. He put the eagle on his arm. Right at that time, the sun started to rise. God was waking up, you know? Okay. So he said to the eagle, listen to me. Tell it, listen to me. He said, all your life, they told you were chicken. They gave you chicken food. They told you to walk like chicken, but you're not a chicken. You're an eagle. You see how far that sun is? You can fly all the way to the sun. That chicken can't fly there, only you. The eagle sat there. He looked at the man. He looked at the farmer and the chicken brother and sister. He looked at the sun and he said, I think if I don't try this thing, every day this man will come and bother me. So maybe I just try so I can show him. He opened up his wings, my people. Oh, you never seen such beautiful wings. He started to fly toward the sun. He went so far, my eye could never see him again. And that's the whole reason I came to Anaheim this morning, to tell you people will try to tell you plan like chicken, spend money like chicken, write grant application like chicken, talk like chicken, but you're not chicken, You eagles. You can fly. You can fly. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.